feel like calling it sweater math makes sweater math actually sound scarier than it really is. When we're talking about sweater math, and in this section in particular, I've got some notes. I have some notes in front of me, and in this section in particular, I'm probably going to be looking down at the notes just to make sure that I don't get myself tumbled around with the numbers, saying them out loud, and that I'm telling you the right thing. So when we talk about sweater math, especially in terms of adapting a pattern that's already written, so we're not having to do all of the math involved in grading, we're really just figuring out how much our gauge is going to change the finished dimensions of the sweater. When that's the kind of math that we're talking about, we're really talking mainly about one fairly simple equation, and we're talking about comparing ratios. So it's the kind of math that you would be doing if you were trying to figure out a percentage, right? So if the main garment measurement that most sweater patterns currently use to give you an idea of the finished dimensions of the garment is the bust measurement. So that's going to be your guiding light in terms of sweater math in this context, right? So if the bust measurement is X, that's your variable, what you're trying to figure out based on the swatching that you've done, the fabric that you're happy with, you want to figure out what that garment is going to look like at the end, we're solving for X. And what we're going to plug that into is an equation where we have on one side your stitch gauge, right? So whatever number of stitches your final swatch gave you over 4 inches or 10 centimeters, and that's going to be the first ratio. That is the ratio that we're going to apply to the other numbers to get our X. So your stitch gauge over 4 inches or 10 centimeters equals the number of bust stitches in the pattern, so the number of stitches that the pattern gives you after you've split for sleeves, in the case of a top-down yoke or raglan sweater, that number of stitches over X. That's your basic equation. That's the equation that we're going to use over and over again today. It's really not, it looks scary because there are lots of words in it. I feel like whenever you're throwing words and letters into math, it makes it look scarier, but it really is just a simple ratio. And X gives you your final bust dimension. Now, when you're doing this kind of equation, the main thing to keep in mind is that you're going to be multiplying as you cross diagonally across the equal sign, and you're going to be dividing anytime you're moving vertically. So in this case, we're moving diagonally from bust stitches to 4 inches or 10 centimeters. So you're going to multiply the number of bust stitches by 4 inches, and then you're going to divide that by your gauge stitches, and that will give you X. Now, what if you haven't bought the pattern yet, right? What if you don't know the number of bust stitches? Because that's the only part of this that you can't figure out just from swatching and looking at the pattern description on Ravelry or on a designer's website or on Etsy. You can reverse engineer this based on other information that the designer has given you to get the number of stitches at the bust of the garment. So let's talk about that next, right? Let's call that variable Y. Just to keep from confusing ourselves, Y is the number of stitches at the bust. We can't have two variables in the pattern in our equation, right? So we need to find another piece of information to bring in. We're going to use this time the designer's gauge, so not your gauge, not the gauge that you found from your swatch, but the designer's gauge. In the case of the Polino pullover, we're looking at 24 stitches for 4 inches. This is going to be equal to Y, the number of stitches at the bust. We're keeping that position, even though it's now going to be a variable. And underneath, what we'll put instead of X is the size that you were looking at knitting. So let's do 2 examples of this, just because I feel like it's quite confusing just saying all of this out loud, and it will make a lot more sense and be a lot clearer with some actual numbers. So let's say we're trying to find the number of stitches at the bust for size 1. I'm choosing size 1 here just because it's a good, round, easy number, and I think will be the clearest example to start with. So in that case, our equation is going to be 24 stitches over 4 inches equals Y over 38 inches. And to do that math, right, then to actually take that equation and solve for Y, what we're going to do is Y equals 38 inches times 24 stitches, because we're moving on the diagonal, so we're multiplying, and then dividing that by 4 inches. Moving down over the vertical line, we divide. 38 times 24 divided by 4 equals 228, and that gives us the number of stitches, or close enough. And the reason that I say close enough is because this becomes a little bit more complicated if you're not dealing with totally round numbers. So, example number 1 for size 1, pretty straightforward. Now let's look at example number 2, which is what I was actually using for my math because I was looking to knit size 2. So, we're doing the same thing, but we're swapping out 44¼ inches instead of 38 inches. That gives us 24 stitches over 4 inches equals y over 44¼ To solve for y, we multiply 44¼ inches times 24 stitches and divide by 4. And that gives us 265.5 stitches. Now, it's not possible to have half a stitch, right? It's not possible for the bust to have 265.5 stitches. But for our purposes here, and having bought the pattern and looked at these numbers, I can tell you that this is absolutely close enough. And especially if you're wanting to do all of this math before you buy the pattern, just to get an idea of if this will work for you, the margin of error should hopefully be small enough that it will give you at least an idea and enough tools to make a decision. So you can either go forward and buy the pattern or decide that maybe you need to find a different pattern. So that's how I would suggest proceeding if you haven't bought the pattern yet and you don't have firm numbers for the bust dimension or any other dimension that you want to look at. The more information that a pattern designer gives you on the landing page before you buy the pattern, the more math you can do. Teddy Litzak is quite generous in that she gives you the full schematic for the sweater as one of the images on the Ravelry page, which means that you can actually apply this math to all sorts of dimensions all over the sweater and figure out, you can come up with a lot of firm information for yourself even before you proceed, which is really nice. But the math will stay the same.